Chapter 5 Living Conditions. Grammary Mansion, Hell. The recently expanded peerage of Rias Grammary appeared in an elaborate entrance hall. The floor space would have been almost the equivalent of the first floor of Issei's entire house. The walls were built of a fine-looking black material. Dark marble or onyx came to mind, but Issei was not knowledgeable enough to know what it was exactly. The floors were a beautiful white marble with a crimson swirl dyed into the stone. The effect was stunning. Painting, tapestries, and portrait photographs of regal-looking devils adorned the walls. Two grand staircases filled the far end and each splayed off in a different direction. One to the west and the other to the east. A dozen doors also led off to different rooms on the ground floor. Issei took it all in with absolute awe. He had never been inside somewhere so elaborate and expensive before. His thoughts were cut short, however, as a man and woman strolled briskly down the right-hand staircase and approached the group. "Ah, you have returned," the man stated in a manner that spoke of royalty. He was tall and well-built. He wore a very expensive light gray suit. Highlights of silver made the suit pop in the light as he moved. The effect only increased the impression of importance on the man. He had crimson hair and aqua eyes, which allowed Issei to immediately know that he was Rias' older brother Serzex, Lucifer of Hell. Yes, Kiba and Issei appear to be physically unharmed by their encounter with the fallen angels. Rias replied to her brother curtly and led the group to meet Serzex and Graphia. Serzex motioned for everyone to follow him and took off at a meaningful pace. Someone in his position could never afford to dawdle. The group took a door on the ground floor heading west from the entrance hall. Issei was blown away by the magnitude of the estate. Every doorway and room they entered was just as opulent as the last. He would wager that a single room of this house would cost more than his entire household put together. Eventually, they came into a large dining room. The table that filled the room had a dozen chairs around it. An immaculately carved chair at the head of the table and an equally extravagant chair to the tail. 5 well-carved but lesser chairs sat to each side of the table. The wood of all the furniture was a dark hue with beautiful streaks and marbling. Gold cushions adorned the seats and an open fireplace warmed the room comfortably. Serzex took the seat to the head and Graphia the tail. Rias took the seat to the right of her brother, Aquino next to her. Issei took the middle set of the other side and Kaneko and Kiba flanked either side of him. "All right," the Lucifer of the Grammary family began. "Tell me everything." Issei and Kiba relayed the entire story. Hunting the scorpion rogue devil. Rainier and Donasik arriving and assaulting the boys. The short skirmish and withdrawal of the fallen angels. Serzex made no attempt to interrupt as the boys spoke and remained quite as the finished. A pensive expression to his face as he rested his chin on the knuckles of his right hand, the elbow comfortably on the dining table. No one spoke in anticipation of his thoughts. "Are you sure they said that they had been after the rogue devil?" he asked, his voice masking all emotion and a purely business expression to his face. "Yes." Issei confirmed with a small nod. "How interesting. Fallen angels have never taken an interest in rogue devils before. Did they give any indication as to where this place that they would be regrouping that they mentioned may be?" he continued with no change to his voice. "None," Issei replied. Serzex was once again quiet as he pondered and assessed his options and strategies. "Well," he began, "it seems that we were lucky that the two of you had been so thorough in tracking down the rogue. Any opportunity to put a spanner in the works of the Grigori is a boon to us, so to speak." He paused. "However, it does concern me that a fallen angel would seek to target you specifically when you are in fact not a devil yourself." Serzex finished up by addressing Issei directly. Issei took a moment to think, but there was no point in not being honest with Serzex. He had been completely open and truthful with Rias. "I believe she is after the Longinus that holds Draeg," Issei stated plainly to the Lord of Hell. Serzex nodded. "Yes, I figured as much. Have you partnered with Draeg yet, or is his power still dormant inside you?" Serzex asked with a mild tinge of curiosity. "He is awake within me. He has helped to train me to the point I am at now and helps me grow further. Issei replied honestly. Ah, is he now? My darling sister failed to mention that the power of the Red Dragon Emperor had actually been awoken. He now directed his words toward Rias. He wasn't malicious, but it was clear that he considered this information to have been something that Rias should have told him. It simply is not my place to speak of another's powers. Rias replied with a cool voice toward her brother. She loved her brother very much, but had no interest in being an informant or pawn of his. Her time of being a bartering chip had been and gone. She had no interest in continuing any such activities. Sursex ignored her attitude toward him and instead spoke back to Issei. Well, that explains why someone so recently augmented was able to fight off an experienced fallen angel so easily. But now we must discuss what the future will hold. Sursex said first to Issei and then the whole group. If fallen angels are operating illegally in our domain, he nodded toward Rias, then House Gremory will have to remove them. This will require a few synchronized effects, however. I will speak with the fallen angel faction head in Japan, Azazel, and find out if they are working on his orders or are independent. I highly suspect that they are in fact independent, as Azazel would dare not incite a war between our factions. Sursex paused and motioned toward his wife. Graphia will utilize her connections to find this rallying point of theirs that they mentioned. Rias, you and your peerage will continue to hunt the rogue devils in the area. If the fallen angels want them, then eliminating them is a priority to deny the enemy their target. Once the location of the fallen angels' base has been located, you are not to interfere in the sweep that I will organize. Does everyone understand? Sursex looked everyone in the eyes to ensure they understood his directions. Most dropped their gaze from him as they nodded. Rias didn't, and Issei maintained eye contact but nodded his understanding. He wouldn't be subservient to Sursex, no matter his power. This small act of confident defiance was noted by the Satan to be discussed with his sister at a later date. Sursex smiled when he was sure that everyone had understood his intent. This leaves just one last piece of business. We must arrange for a protection detail for your residence, Issei. If the fallen angels are so intent on killing you, then they may well act on your home. Compassion filled his voice as he spoke. Even if Issei was of a defiant will, Sursex could never allow someone associated with his family to be unprotected. It was simply not how House Gremory operated. Issei was taken aback at the idea of security moving to his residence. And if he was being honest, he was also a bit offended at the idea that he would need protection. From what he had seen, a well-trained saiyan was more than enough to handle those fallen angels once their advantage of wings was negated. Issei shook his head as he spoke to the Lucifer. I appreciate the offer, but I can handle myself. He spoke directly, but without an intent to cause offense. It was now Surzek's turn to be taken aback. It was very rare that someone didn't do as he said, and never had he been spoken back to in such a manner by a junior member of a peerage. The other members of the peerage were stunned by Issei's rejection of the Lord of Hell's plan. It was just something that never happened. Issei maintained eye contact with Surzek easily and could see the frustration in the Lucifer's eyes. Rias was not prepared for Issei to challenge her brother so openly on their first meeting. She fretted that he was about to be destroyed by Surzek. Sure, Issei was beyond strong, but he wasn't at a level to handle Surzek. She opened her mouth without thinking, and the words that came out shocked herself as much as those around her. What if I moved in with Issei? She immediately fought off a blush as she finished speaking. Issei spun to look at Rias, and Surzek did the same. Now all eyes were on Rias. Explain, Surzek stated with a taut voice to his sister. The idea of his beloved sister living with a teenage boy she had met just over a week ago wasn't something he was jumping to embrace. Well, he is my peerage member. And with myself there, we would definitely be strong enough to repel any fallen angel assault. Also, I have been helping Issei master his energy. Isn't that right, Issei? Rias rattled off rather quickly as she tried to get the words out before her courage broke. She was happy to stand up to her brother when it came to simple things with herself, but this was more than that. She had suggested living with a boy, something she knew Surzex wouldn't be so keen of. Before Surzex, Rias or Issei could add another word, Aquino spoke up with a fast tone as if to sneak her words in before a decision could be made. I will join them. 3 of us will ensure everyone is safe. Right, her voice was reasonable, but Issei felt a burst of butterflies at the idea of both girls living with him. Surzex's face didn't change and Issei was panicking. Was he about to send the 2 girls to live with him? Issei was more than happy to stand up to Surzex. The saiyan blood in himself screamed at him to challenge the powerful devil to a duel or instigate a fight with him for dominance. But there was absolutely no way that he would be able to say no to the 2 beautiful girls. A thought popped into his head and Issei ran with it. My parents, he burst out. They would never allow 2 girls to move into the home that they had never met before. He hoped the logic of his words would stop this plan. As he said it, though, he saw the look on both girls' faces, and it was clear that they were hurt by the idea of him trying to avoid living with them. Issei looked away and glanced to Kiba. The older boy had an amused grin to his face, but it was clear that he had no intention of intervening in this situation. Issei looked at Kaneko and her face read the same as Kiba but without the grin. She simply kept her features neutral but respectful in the presence of the Lucifer. It was Grafia who spoke and Issei was not prepared for her response. We could arrange for the girls to move in with Issei as a class exchange activity. I am sure that you can arrange for his parents to be promoted on an overseas assignment with their companies. That will also remove the risk of human casualties in any crossfire. This might be a much easier situation to set up than trying to assign housemen to the Hayadu residence. Grafia spoke directly to her husband and he listened intently to her. Issei was not prepared for what she had said, but he was amused by the fact that even in the underworld a wife had power over one of the kings of hell. Surzex thought on his wife's proposal and then nodded. You are right, dear. It is the simplest and most logical plan of attack. He paused and addressed the peerage. You are all dismissed now. Rias pack enough to stay for an undetermined amount of time. Aquino, I suggest you do the same, he instructed to each girl and then turned to Issei. I would like you to remain behind a second. Everyone departed the room, leaving the 2 males sitting at the table alone. Issei felt the tension rise slightly in the air. His human side felt uncomfortable and rather afraid of Surzex. But his saiyan side, that was becoming more dominant rapidly every day, wanted nothing more than to test Surzex's power. Surzex took a breath and addressed Issei with a flat tone. I have never been challenged by a junior member of a peerage like that. Were you a devil you would have been punished. His words were hard but not malicious. Issei met his gaze and replied calmly despite his raised heartbeat. Lucky I'm a saiyan and not a devil then. Issei and Surzex stood at the same time. Surzex unleashed some of his power. Wings sprouting from his back. Issei released ki through his body on instinct. It was something he had never done before, but his body told him to do it. The power of the ki flooded him and his tail uncurled as a white aura flared up around him. With his ki supplementing himself, Issei felt more powerful than he had before. This was something he would have to remember for the future. Saiyan and Devil stared each other down silently in a battle of wills. For nearly 3 minutes, neither broke eye contact or moved a muscle. Eventually, a smirk spread across Surzex's face and at the same time across Issei's. You are either incredibly brave and sure of your power or ridiculously foolish and stupid. Surzex quipped half-heartedly as his wings receded. Issei absorbed the ki flowing around his body and the aura vanished, his tail flopping back down and around his tail. It is definitely the first one, he said with a voice full of confidence. Surzex's smile increased. Good, because my baby sister is in your hands. Surzex's voice tinged with deep affection and care for his younger sister. Issei understood exactly where he was coming from and extended his hand toward the Lord of Hell in a display of respect. Surzex took the hand and the 2 shook. Had he just accepted Issei? Before releasing Issei's hand, he spoke with a cold tone. If she gets pregnant, though, he left the words unspoken, and Issei knew that he would face a wrath he couldn't handle no matter how strong he became. Issei nodded to Surzex and they broke the contact. Issei turned and let himself out of the room. He made his way back to the entrance hall and found Rias waiting for him alone. "What did my brother want?" she asked. She felt suddenly self-conscious at being alone with Issei again. 4 packed suitcases sat by her feet. Issei smirked at her and in a voice filled with confidence replied, "Just normal guy talk. Nothing serious." "Where are the others?" He changed the topic quickly, not wanting to tell her that he just had a showdown with her brother. Rias looked at him skeptically for a moment before accepting his answer and replying, "They have all left already. I was waiting for you so that we can go to your place together. Akino will meet us there tomorrow morning before school to drop her things off," she said very matter-of-factly toward Issei. Issei was surprised by this. How could these things could be organized so quickly? It just made no sense to him. Surely it would take time for such changes to be orchestrated and implemented. "But what about my parents?" "Anytime soon they will be home," he said, as both a statement and question. Rias smiled. "You would be amazed at just how quickly Graphia can get pretty much anything organized. Being a queen of hell comes with some serious pull." Rias paused before becoming uncertain and continuing, "Did you not want me to move in with you?" She tried to keep the fear of his rejection out of her voice as she asked him, but failed to mask it all. Issei looked concerned. No, not at all. I really enjoy your company. I like being around everyone. I was just really concerned about my parents." "I know they would be uncomfortable with the situation," he replied to her, feeling embarrassed and awkward. Rias nodded and smiled. She didn't say anything more but summoned the Gremry teleportation symbol around them. At the last moment, before they vanished, she took his hand in hers. Bedroom, 19 Hyoto Lane, Kuo Town. The pair appeared in Issei's bedroom and broke the hand contact immediately. Issei told Rias that she could have his bedroom tonight again and he would use the couch again. Rias tried to argue against it again, but Issei would have nothing of it, stating that no man worth his salts would let a woman sleep on a couch while he took the bed. Rias nodded quietly, and as Issei exited the room she mumbled to herself that she wouldn't be sleeping in his bed anyway. With Issei's enhanced hearing he caught the words. He knew exactly what she had meant and chose to not address them yet. If he was being honest with himself, he had loved waking up next to her and wouldn't deny her if she wanted to join him again. Issei went through the house looking for a sign of whether his parents had returned home yet. He found that they had indeed been there. A few articles of clothing lay on the floor of their bedroom and it appeared as if they had packed suitcases in a hurry. Issei knew they wouldn't leave without telling him and checked his phone. Sure enough, he had a half-dozen missed calls and a voicemail. It seemed his cellular coverage didn't extend to hell, he thought with a chuckle. He replayed the voicemail and listened as his parents spoke excitedly. They had both been promoted rather abruptly but were required to take positions in the United States for his father and England for his mother. His parents rattled off the details at a blistering pace. Clearly they had been rushing to meet flights. They spoke of 2 new roommates that Issei would have, but clearly hadn't known that Rias and Akino were 2 gorgeous women that would be living with him. They finished off by speaking of a chaperone who would be ensuring everything went smoothly. A Mr. Gremry. Issei burst into laughter at that, and Rias came into the room to find out what had caused him to have such an outburst. He replayed the last part of the voicemail for her. She gave him an inquisitive look and spoke calmly to him. "What's so funny about my brother being the chaperone?" Clearly Rias didn't see Issei's point. "One of the lords of hell is my chaperone," Issei said in a deadpan voice. Realization dawned on Ria's face and she smirked. "I guess when you say it like that it is pretty funny," she agreed with him. The pair left Issei's parents' room and he suggested making dinner. Rias was going to say that she would do it, but he had already started getting things out of the pantry. She settled herself down on a stool on the opposite side of the workspace to him. Rias was impressed by how easily Issei handled himself in the kitchen, but she remembered that for the most part he was completely self-sufficient and didn't require mothering. Definitely boyfriend material. She looked away and shook her head at that thought. Issei saw her shake her head while averting her eyes from looking at his muscular body from the corner of his eye. He saw her attention become intently focused on the metal trim of his kitchen sink and spoke up with mild concern. Her actions were cute, but he wanted to be sure was feeling comfortable. "Are you all right?" "Oh, I'm fine. Just tired." Rias covered for herself. It was in fact late, and after eating the pair would have to head to bed. Rias flicked her eyes back when she thought Issei wouldn't notice and watched as he prepared a half-dozen large pizzas. The dough was prepared in the fridge and he told her he had made it the night before for tonight. She excused herself to shower while he diced up meat and vegetables for the toppings. Issei focused entirely on the culinary process he was absorbed in and not that Rias was now naked in his house. Thoughts like that would only distract himself. Rias returned 15 minutes later as Issei was pulling the food from the oven. She wore a snug-fitting white dressing gown. The material looked soft and puffy. A very comfortable garment. A hood hung at the back, but she left it off and she dried her wet hair that hung down across her shoulders. "That smells amazing," she commented honestly at the food he had prepared. Issei smirked to her. "I made some unique topping choices. I love them, but I understand if you aren't as keen about them as I am," he said to her honestly. He was mainly referencing the caramelized onion and sweet potato pizza that he had made. He really enjoyed the combination, but he knew it wasn't for everyone. The pair dug into the food. As usual, Issei consumed a good 80% of the food on the table, but Rias tried at least one slice of each pizza. She found the pair of pizzas that he had referenced to as his odd flavors. She actually enjoyed them, especially the fried banana and chicken combination. It was sweet and delicious. The wall clock above the dining table chimed 11 as the pair cleaned up from their late-night dinner. Issei went directly over to the couch and extended it out before collecting some bedding. He was finishing setting up the bed when he turned to see Rias standing before him holding two pillows from his bed. She threw one to him and then put the other down on the side of the extended bed she stood next to. Issei noticed that all the other lights in the house were off. She clearly had no intention of sleeping in his room tonight. Before Issei could say anything, Rias dropped her dressing gown, revealing a smooth pink nightgown that hugged her body in all the right places without being overly revealing. Issei swallowed nervously and watched as Rias climbed into the makeshift double bed. She patted the side of the mattress that he would be sleeping on and Issei acquiesced to her request. There would be no arguing. He did, however, delay for a second and Rias spoke up. "I thought we could work more on your key control tonight," she said as if to justify her sleeping with Issei. He knew it was a weak excuse, but that was all he needed to justify the situation for himself. He removed his shirt and lay down and naturally rolled in toward the center of the bed. Both were close and facing each other. She looked shyly away from his eyes, but their gaze continued to meet every few minutes. Issei whispered goodnight to her and she did the same with both of the pair closing their eyes. Issei had nervous butterflies flying around inside his stomach. As he is drifting off, he reached over and took Rias' right hand in his left one. He felt her hand snuggle into his palm as he did so. Within moments he had controlled his breathing and focused on entering his own realm. Rias smiled at the contact Issei initiated. She knew he would justify it as a way to bring her into his mind, but she also knew that both of them were enjoying the intimacy between themselves. Again she pondered the feelings she felt for him and their similarity to the butterflies that sometimes arose when a certain drag-haired beauty teased her. She felt the tug of his key on her mind and, ignoring her inner turmoil, relaxed to allow it. It was as if being at the apex of a titanic roller coaster and then going over the edge as fast as was ever possible. The dropping feeling left and Rias opened her eyes to a world of white nothingness. She looked around. Issei stood to her right and Drake sat in a very cat-like posture to the other side of Issei. "How nice of you to visit again, Miss Gremery," Drake said in a polite and inviting manner. Likewise, Rias replied to the friendly dragon. "Why are we in nothing though?" "I was expecting to be somewhere like last time," she asked toward the pair. Issei replied to her with a thoughtful voice. "I thought tonight I would try a second memory from the past," he directed toward Drake, who nodded and created another wisp of memories. Issei continued to Rias, I create the different environments to train in with my ki, and I was going to wait until I saw how the scions of the past trained before choosing a location to conjure for tonight. Rias nodded at Issei's explanation. He really was the master of this domain. Rias watched as Issei reached out and his hand passed through the ethereal wisp. As he did so, his body became rigid for a moment and Rias was unsure of what exactly was happening. Memory wisp Issei fell through the air toward a firm ground of metal in the memory in just the same manner as he had the last time. This time, however, he was prepared for the travel into the past memory of a forgotten hero. Issei was hoping to see something that would help him control his ki or a fighting style he could learn to supplement the techniques and combat style that Kaneko had taught him. He landed softly on the metal sheets. Looking around, Issei saw that he had arrived in a form of military installation of some kind. It looked very futuristic and was a complete contrast to the previous memory he had been able to observe. The room that he found himself in was shaped to be a large dome. The roof stood at some 40 feet above him. Close to the top, windows ringed the walls and Issei could see people observing from the other side, but the dark glass meant he couldn't make out their features. On the ground level, 3 doors led into the room. 2 were regular-sized doors like those he would find in his house, but the third was a massive garage-style door that a double-deck bus could pass through with no concern at all. One of the regular doors phased out of existence and a body entered the room. Once he was inside the room, the door rematerialized. He was shorter than Issei, and Issei guessed his age to be around 12. Give or take a year for the onset of puberty. The boy's body was extremely muscular. He had black hair that stood entirely upright to a harsh peak. He wore a blue bodysuit that was designed entirely for practicality but emphasized the boy's extreme physique. White gloves and boots adorned the boy's hands and feet. A black tail was wrapped casually around his waist in much the same manner that Issei did. What caught Issei's attention the most was the scion boy's face. He wore a mixture of supreme pride and arrogance across his features, and his black eyes looked remorseless. The boy walked to the center of the room and waited with his hands crossed. He waited patiently, and Issei stepped back to take in the whole scene, awaiting something interesting to happen. He didn't have to wait long as the other regular door phased out and a dozen green creatures walked into the room. They had insect-like bodies. They stood on 2 short legs to a height of about 4 feet tall. Each hand ended in 3 claws that mashed in and out as they surrounded the boy. As the last one entered the room, that door reappeared as well. The creatures had deformed flat faces and their mouths drooled saliva through sharp teeth. Issei was revolted by the small creatures, and if they had approached him, he would have had no issue destroying them. A signal must have been given as the creatures all rushed at the boy. He dodged and weaved their blows with practiced efficiency. This kid was amazingly well trained, and Issei knew that if they were to fight now, that he would definitely lose. The creatures attacked more ferociously than Kaneko had done, and Issei watched intently at each move the boy made. He subconsciously moved his body in response to the boy's movements. His scion instincts were absorbing and learning the movements and patterns of this ancient fighter. The boy seemed to grow tired of simply dodging and took to the offensive. His strikes tore into the small creatures. Although they were roughly the same size as him, the boy decimated them with practically no effort at all. His fighting style was extremely aggressive. Harsh strikes, blows, kicks and elbows with little regard for the defensive. Issei studied all of his movements and even began to see a few flaws in the small defense the boy put between each strike that could be exploited. It was clear that this boy greatly favored being on the offensive and knew that his superior power would render victory onto himself. Issei was keen to learn all the techniques this boy possessed and amalgamate them with the style he had already began to learn care of Kaneko. It would grant him versatility on both the offense and defense. The creatures attacking the boy were thrown against the ground or walls from the strikes he made. However, they continued to regain their feet and continue the assault. As the minutes passed, Issei expected the young boy to tire, but he kept going as if this were merely a warm-up for him. Issei watched as the boy took a deep breath and concentrated between dodging 2 swipes. A harsh white aura flared up around his body. The aura of the boy's ki. This was an added bonus for Issei. The boy had unleashed his ki to strengthen himself in the same manner as he had in his brief standoff with Surzex. The boy's speed and power increased 20-fold. Some creatures were eviscerated by his blows and their numbers dropped rapidly to 4. The last 4 went to flee from the room and the boy held out his hand toward them with the palm raised. A perfectly formed ki ball appeared in his hand. The ki was a soft yellow, but unlike Issei's, it sat calmly with no urge to rage and send tendrils out. The power it emitted was magnitudes higher than Issei produced with his undisciplined knockoffs. As the boy shot it at the first creature, the ki ball was instantly replaced with another in his palm. 4 shots for 4 enemies. Each shot made impact with the back of his target's head and the creature was disintegrated immediately. So that is what perfectly formed ki looked like. Issei was about ready to leave this memory. He had taken a lot in from fighting styles and techniques to the application of harnessing ki to strengthen your own body and correct ki attacks. He paused, however, when he saw the large door phase out and a creature much like the others lumbered into the room. This one, however, was monstrous in size. At least 20 feet tall. It would give Drake a run for his money in terms of raw size and mass. Issei watched the creature's mouth open wide and roar at the boy. Like the last memory, Issei couldn't hear anything, but the spittle flying from the creature's mouth made the roar obvious. He looked to the young boy to watch his expression grow into a dark and confident smile. The boy screamed in response and his aura grew brighter and raged around him. Issei was transfixed. He had never seen this level of ki control before. It was incredible. The boy stopped screaming and launched himself at the beast. Or flew. Issei was unsure. The speed the boy possessed was immense, and one moment he was standing 30 feet from the creature, the next he was above it driving his fists hammer-style into its skull. The two traded blows and strikes, but it was obvious the boy had a clear advantage in terms of skill, speed, and power. His strikes staggered the beast, yet on the few times it was able to land a blow, the boy shrugged off the attacks as if he had been hit by a scrunched-up piece of paper. Issei wondered if the boy was in fact flying, as he never seemed to touch the ground. He continued his assault with brutal kicks, punch, and strike combinations. Eventually, he landed below the creature and launched it into the air toward the ceiling. Issei then watched as the boy cupped his hands to his right side as if he was holding a ball and burying his fingers into the material of it. The palms of his hands faced each other and the boy shouted something that Issei couldn't hear. A bright purple energy filled the space between the boy's hands. Issei could feel the raw power of the ki in the boy's hands, and it was greater than any energy he had felt before. Higher than the aura the boy had unleashed, higher than the feeling of power that Surzex had shown him, and more than any opponent he fought possessed. The boy's aura changed to the same purple as the attack he charged. He thrust his arms forward of himself, screaming something. Issei watched his lips, trying to decipher the words he had said. A beam of purple energy rushed from his hands toward the monster. It was unable to do anything as the energy engulfed it and ripped its body to pieces. Chunks of flesh and bone littered down to the ground, but the majority of the creature simply vanished. Not even dust remained. The blast didn't stop there though, and tore through the roof of the building and out into the outside world. With his victory complete, the young warrior released his built-up energy and walked calmly from the room. Issei was completely blown away. He didn't even look tired. He had underestimated the boy. If they fought, he wouldn't just be beaten, he would be obliterated. He smiled. This was perfect. The power that boy wielded was now his new goal. He would surpass that boy. He felt himself float up, and the speed built before the world fluttered. White nothingness. Issei's mind. Rias watched for a few seconds as Issei was frozen, but then he moved and she was puzzled as to what had just occurred. Drake spoke before she could though, and his tone of voice showed that there was no need for concern. It was a useful experience, I hope, he both stated and asked of Issei. Issei felt his saiyan emotions still raging from the excitement at what he had just witnessed, and the grin that broke across his face was reminiscent of a child on Christmas Day. Definitely, he replied gleefully, his voice full of unbridled excitement. Rias was confused as to what had just happened, but Issei began retelling the story of everything he had just witnessed. The power the boy possessed, his control over Ki. Issei's suspicion that he could fly, and lastly the devastating attack he had unleashed against the monster. Rias realized that in those moments that Issei had been still, his statuesque stillness had been due to his mind absorbing the memory he had just recounted to her. Issei addressed Draig directly. "Can I fly with Ki?" his voice still excited despite the speed with which he had recounted his tale. Draig pondered on it for a moment. "I cannot personally view the memories I have collected inside me, but I suppose with correct Ki control it would be possible. I suspect it would be like pushing yourself away from the ground and maintaining it whilst you moved about and manipulated yourself through the air." Draig speculated aloud. Issei smiled at the confirmation of his suspicion. Even if Draig wasn't entirely sure if it was possible, Issei knew he would have to try once he had mastered his Ki properly. He concentrated, and the whiteness changed suddenly. In place of the nothingness, a vast open dirt desert appeared. Rocks and boulders littered the ground as far as the eye could see. Issei nodded toward Draig, who had taken to perching on one of the largest rocks. As Draig settled in comfortably, the red armor Issei trained and engulfed his body. It was heavier this time, and Draig explained with a smile that he had increased the weight of the suit to help push Issei further. Issei thanked him and told Rias he would be doing a physical regime before practicing his Ki. She said it was fine and took to Draig's side, sitting comfortably next to the dragon and discussing the memories he possessed and how they interacted with Issei. As Devil and Dragon spoke, Draig used his magic to float the rocks and boulders into the air, at which point they circled Issei and attacked him in a manner similar to the creatures attacking the boy. Issei dropped into the defensive posture that Kaneko had taught him and began dodging the rocks. The added weight of his armor made each movement more difficult, but he pushed through and then switched to the offensive. He struck the rocks as the young saiyan had. Issei attacked harshly with combinations of kicks, strikes, and throws. The aggression of the style he was displaying was something Rias had never seen before. She knew that Issei was using what he had learnt in the memory, but she was stunned by how well he had assimilated all the knowledge and how capably he was now fighting with it all. She mentioned this to Draig, who was now having to concentrate a bit harder on attacking with the rocks thanks to Issei's change in fighting style. The Saiyan race all have a perfect affinity for martial arts and combat. They learn new abilities at an alarming rate, and with an unlimited potential, they are able to continue to learn new combinations while refining old ones effortlessly. Draig explained to Rias before he continued. "Issei hasn't learned perfectly though. If you look closely you can see faults in the movements he is making, but he is adjusting and correcting himself rapidly, and I do not think it will be too long before he is able to use both this new style and the one he learned from your friend Kaneko with precise ease." The dragon let a proud tone fill his voice as he spoke of Issei's growth and potential. Rias felt that same pride as she watched Issei fight against the animated adversaries. Issei continued his training for almost 3 more hours before stopping, breathing in great gulps of air and then yelling over to Rias and Draig as he continued to fight his granite opponents. "Rias," he called out harshly to get her attention. "Fire your magic at me." His voice was confident, and it was clear that while he was tiring, he had no intention of stopping anytime soon. Rias looked at him from the sideline. "Excuse me," she called back. Surely he hadn't asked her to attack him. "I need more of a challenge," he replied. "Attack me with your magic. I want to try something." Rias looked at Draig, who shrugged at her. She formed a cluster of magical destruction balls and fired them at Issei. He dodged the magical blasts as he continued smashing through the rocks and boulders. Rias saw that he was easily able to handle the magic moving at such slow speeds, and so she increased their velocity. If he wanted a challenge, then she would give it to him. Draig joined her by increasing the speed and power with which the rocks moved, and Issei was beginning to become overwhelmed. Issei was focused on dodging Rias' orbs of destruction magic, and this caused him to take several hits from the levitating chunks of rock and earth. Despite the abruptness of the strikes, it was exactly what the Saiyan wanted. He knew the challenge and difficulty would bring out more power. He calmed his thoughts with controlled breaths as he went purely on the defensive. He felt through himself for the power of the Ki that lay welled up within the depths of his being. It floated all around his body and outside it in the realm of his mind. Slowly, he tapped into the energy and let the power flow through himself as he had earlier that evening with Surzex, but this time he controlled the flow. He dug deeper and a guttural yell involuntarily broke his lips. His aura of white ki flowed from his body. Ragged and wispy at first, but as he pulled more at the ki, it grew and raged more powerful than before. Issei focused on mimicking the boy from in the memory. The white aura flared brightly as he yelled out. The boulders and magical orbs within meters of him were wiped from existence by the power of his ki, and Issei leapt back to put distance between himself and the remaining oncoming projectiles. He landed and felt the raw power flowing within himself. He let out a long breath, his mind and body calmed, but the power remained. This was how you controlled ki. It made sense to him. Raging power would succumb to and obey a calm and peaceful mind. He felt his focus heighten, his awareness hone in and sharpen to the world around him. He raised his right arm with the palm faced toward the mass of objects flying toward him. Ki pooled in his hand. It was a perfect blue-white sphere. No blemish or tendril escaped the mass. It took far less energy to summon forth a perfect ki ball than his imperfect ones, as he didn't have to waste any of his energy fighting to control it. With an exhale of breath, Issei released the shot and it sailed with laser precision, making perfect impact on his targets, evaporating the orb of Rias destruction energy along with itself. Issei summoned another and then another and then another. As each one shot off, he replaced it. Within a minute, the space between himself and the other pair was clear. They simply watched him. Rias was amazed at how well he was controlling his ki. She wasn't even slightly annoyed at how well he had destroyed her magic. She was simply proud of his control. Drake felt pride in the exact same way for his new host. Issei stood almost 100 meters away from the pair. His blazing white aura still raged around him, illuminating and reflecting light off the gleaming red armor he adorned. Despite its harsh movement, the ki itself was calm and emitted a feeling of raw power. Issei ran forward and broke into a sprint. Less than 2 seconds later, he came to a perfect halt in front of Rias. Rias was dumbstruck. He was so fast and in all that weighted armor to boot. Very well done. Drake responded. Issei removed his helmet and dismissed his aura. The feeling of power became subdued but sat comfortably under the surface. Now that Issei had tapped his ki reserves properly, he knew he would access the power easily. As if he now had a roadmap showing a bypass to the destination. Such incredible power, Issei. Rias said simply to him. He smiled to her and thanked her. I couldn't have done it without you. I applied what you taught me last time to my training over the last few days and reinforced it with what I learned tonight. The combination FO the points worked perfectly for my new style, he said honestly to her. Rias blushed slightly at his praise. The group spoke for a few minutes as Issei rested from his exertions. Drake explained that unleashing his ki would drain Issei's power a lot faster, but that like any muscles, using his reserves also caused them to grow and deepen. This was part of the reason why saiyan ate so much. They had naturally larger reserves than other beings. Issei nodded at all this and informed the pair that his next goals would be to learn the powerful attack the boy had unleashed and to be able to fly. For the remaining time, Issei concentrated on his ki techniques, attempting to control the ki further. He knew he wasn't ready to attempt flight yet, but would be close soon. As for the boy's attack, he would need to figure out what exactly the boy done and possible what he had chanted. Issei could picture the way his mouth had moved, but there was just so many phonetic combinations it could have been. He tried focusing in and channeling his ki, but that alone produced little more than the spheres of ki he had already generated. Mastering them, however, was yet another aspect that was certain to help him. Each element and technique was a piece to the puzzle of unlocking more power and diversity from his ki. Rias, feeling rather inspired by Issei's progress, decided to practice her magic while he trained his ki. She had made the decision that she would need to strengthen her magic with how easily his ki shots had dispelled her balls of destruction. Sure, she didn't put much power into the magic she fired at him, but still it was magic of destruction and shouldn't be able to be dispelled. Feeling a little conflicted over the matter, she was still happy to have something to train toward now. After a further 2 hours, the pair were finished and were relaxing beside each other, both recovering from the exertions of controlling their respective energy and continuing to learn about the other. Issei listened to Rias describe her childhood and learning some ballet under the direction and guidance of her mother when a thought entered his mind. Rias, he began when she had finished with her attention now firmly on him. What will your parents think of you moving in with me? We didn't see them earlier. Rias smiled at Issei's concern before answering, they will accept Surzek's decision, he is a lord of hell and besides, he is rather protective of myself and Aquino. He wouldn't put us in harm's way deliberately. As for where they were, they are touring enterprises run by our interest for the next month to assess the efficiency of Gremory influence. Issei accepted her reasoning without much recourse to respond, but found another question opened, what about Aquino's parents? This time Rias paused for a moment with a flash of sadness to her eyes as she looked away from him before answering softly. That is something you should speak to her about. Issei couldn't claim to be the most knowledgeable about personal relationships or women but knew when not to push a topic further and so simply allowed a soft silence to fill the space between them before suggesting they should return to reality. Rias agreed and after a brief goodbye to Drake, they sat with eyes closed as Issei broke the link to his mind, bringing them back to the real world. Rias opened her eyes to the physical world once more. Issei lay still facing her. His eyes were locked on hers and their hands still together as they had been when the pair fell asleep the night before. It was early morning. They would have to get up soon if they were to be at school on time. Rias bit her lip as they looked at each other. Both could feel the charge between them and Issei leant forward toward her. Rias closed her eyes. She knew what he was doing. They had known each other for such a short period of time and yet she knew that she wanted him to do it. Issei had his eyes shut, his lips pursed forward, and the distance between their lips began to close. Before they could meet, the front door to Issei's house was banged open and the pair jumped apart from each other. Rias flat on her back and Issei had launched himself with shock vertical into the air and out of the bed onto the floor. He looked directly to the front hallway as Aquino walked into the room. She was already dressed in her school uniform and carried a long overnight bag in her left hand. She looked at the scene before her. Rias laying on her back on the mattress in a nightgown. The sheets thrown everywhere and Issei standing rigidly by the bed in just the pair of pants he had worn the night before. She let her eyes devour the sight of his exposed muscular body. A sly smirk crossed her face. I hope I'm not interrupting anything, she said in a voice that clearly indicated she indeed knew she had interrupted something. Issei had no idea how to respond and shook his head vigorously. Rias, however, regained her composure much easier and sat upright. Not at all, we were just in Issei's mindscape, she said in a voice filled with false dignity. She hoped that Aquino would fall for the bait, ignore the awkward situation and believe her. She was glad when Aquino replied. Oh, his mind place. What's that and how did you do it? It was clear that she was disappointed that more interesting things hadn't been happening and Issei was very happy for the change of subject. He slipped away to shower and dress himself while Rias explained about the way in which he trained his ki and her entering to assist with his training. Aquino looked at Rias with a sly sideways glance as Rias finished the explanation. Okay, I believe you, but why the sexy negligee then? She said before bounding off down the hallway. Rias blushed deeply at the last statement. It was clear that her clothing choice was for one reason only. Issei heard his bedroom door open as he tied the laces to his shoes. He looked up to see Aquino walking in. Shame I missed the show, she quirked without a sign of shyness at her comment. Issei coughed slightly. She was so abrupt. He did like Aquino, she was a nice person from what he had seen. Just very forward in her mannerisms and speech. Yeah, he began. Do you need something? I was just getting dressed. Oh, I'm fine. Just checking the place out, came her reply in a very offhand manner but made no effort to leave his room. Issei waited knowing that she would have more to say and he was right when she turned directly to him a moment later after having examined a remote control card that he had sitting on a shelf. The look on her face said that she had come to a decision regarding that which she had been pondering. I want to visit your mine tonight as well, she blurted out toward him. A red tinge took to her face as she made her request, or was it a demand? Issei knew it would be something like that. With how flirtatious Akino was and the look of disappointment that she had displayed last night when she thought he had rejected her in Rias, he knew that she would be jealous of what Rias had seen. He nodded toward her. Okay, he replied simply. She smiled broadly as his acceptance and left the room. He finished tying his shoes and left the bedroom. The couch had been reset by Rias and breakfast was laid out on the dining table. Akino had brought it with her. Omelets that she bought on the way to his place. She said the clerk had been stunned when she ordered 30, but she knew Issei would eat a massive amount. He thanked her for the generosity and they all dug into the delicious food. Once they finished eating, Rias used her magic to change into her school clothes and both girls then vanished into the bathroom for 10 minutes while Issei waited. When they exited, he realized that they had been doing their hair and makeup. He wondered why they didn't simply use magic for it. He pondered if perhaps there was some things that their magic just wasn't suited for. Soon enough the three had left for school. Issei couldn't help but notice the stares that their group got from everyone they passed. He was flanked either side by the two youthful beauties. Boys and men alike shot looks of jealousy at him. Girls and women looked with envy at the two girls. It was a complete change from the relative isolation with which he used to live so comfortably. He was unsure which he preferred if he was being honest. Once they arrived at school, Issei said his goodbyes to the two girls and went toward his class. The two girls walked together, theirs being is that they were in the same class. Rias sat in her seat with Akino sitting next to her. They were the only ones in the room as it was still much earlier than most students arrived at school. She had felt the slight tension between her and Akino that had stayed between the two from that morning. She faced her best friend who was busy doing something on her phone and spoke to her. Okay, I can feel something is up with you. What is it? She asked directly. Akino faced her. I know you like Issei, she said simply. Rias couldn't stop the blush that filled her face. Well, what of it? I can like who I want, she said back to her friend, but now in an argumentative tone. Akino nodded to her. Of course. But he isn't the only person you like, shooting a seductive smirk toward Rias. She continued, you can deny it all you want, but you need to be honest with your feelings anyway. I just wanted to let you know that I like him too. And I am going to ask him out, she said the words to Rias bluntly. Akino didn't want to hurt her friend, she loved her too much, and Akino knew that her feeling for Rias were far less than platonic, with her flirting to the other girl becoming more abrupt, but she did want to be direct with her. It was the respectful thing to do when telling the girl that you have subtly flirted with that you will also be going after the guy that she now likes. Rias was annoyed to say the least. Issei was the boy she wanted to ask, and while she accepted Akino's flirting with him, it was something she did with all men after all, and herself, if she was being honest to what she suspected of her friend's feelings, she wouldn't just accept her taking the guy she liked. Well, I am going to beat you to asking him then. Rias replied. Honestly, she felt nervous about asking Issei out, and if Akino hadn't intervened then she would have waited for Issei to make the first move, as she wasn't too keen on rushing a relationship. The girls glared at each other for a moment, but the influx of other students made them stop. They simply didn't look at or talk to each other during the classes. Issei was the first to reach the clubhouse for lunch, have spent the latter half of the previous week eating a meagerly sized lunch in the cafeteria. He was keen to get back into the large feast provided for the club. The spread of food was already on the table, and Issei sat staring at each and every morsel whilst waiting patiently for everyone else to arrive. Trying to resist the food took more willpower than controlling his ki, as it felt like his whole being was screaming to consume every last dish down to the crumbs. Kiba and Kaneko were the first to arrive together, and he distracted himself with simple conversation before Akino and Rias entered, not speaking to each other. The moment the stunning pair sat, Issei buried himself in the food. His willpower could only go so far with the food right in front of him smelling as good as it was. The lunch break was short due to exams being conducted that afternoon, and the group barely finished before having to leave. Issei had a history and then a math exam that would dominate his afternoon. Each exam ran for 2 hours, and by the time his class was released, the majority of the student body had already left for the day. Issei went home feeling confident with his efforts in the exams. He felt like he had put in work that would score at least a B grade. Rias and Aquino had returned home much earlier than Issei and began unpacking. However, they were uncertain where to place their belongings. Issei's family wasn't poor, but they were nowhere near wealthy. The home had only 2 bedrooms. As such, they left their belongings in the living room until he would arrive home and they could discuss living arrangements. The tension still existed between the two, but both girls wanted to speak with the other. They had been best friends for so long and were moving toward the potential for something more. It hurt to bicker with each other, and they rarely fought. Aquino took a seat next to Rias and spoke first. "Look, I get that you like him. But I do too, and want to see if it is real," she said simply. The flirtatious tone that usually accented her voice wasn't present. Simple honesty was present. "I know," Rias replied. "I feel the same way about him. But I don't want to fight or lose you as my best friend." She spoke honestly to Aquino as well. "I just felt uncomfortable because you're so beautiful and I don't like the idea of competing with you," she finished up saying. Aquino smiled at her. "You're more beautiful than I am, Rias. I would be the one competing with you," her words still humble. Both girls wore slight blushes at the compliments the other had given them. Aquino dropped her head onto Rias' shoulder and Rias pulled her queen into a sideways hug. The pair stayed like that, just talking about simple things and enjoying the other's company, when they heard the sound of the front door opening and Issei returning home. The saiyan entered the lounge room to see the 2 girls sitting cozily on the couch. They seemed engrossed in some sort of girl conversation and both smiled to him as he approached them. Rias brought up the topic that would need to be discussed first. "So Aquino and I were trying to work out where we should put our stuff," she stated simply to him. Issei thought for a few minutes. "Well, we only have 2 bedrooms. My parents aren't using theirs though, and it is large with a queen-size bed if you both don't mind sharing," he suggested, the only thing he could think of. Both girls considered his reply before nodding to him. They all made their way to the master bedroom. Issei cleared his parents' remaining possessions into cardboard boxes that had been left in the attic from when they moved in. Aquino and Rias placed their belongings into the room and made themselves comfortable. Rias took the side furthest from the door and Aquino claimed the closest side to the door. Both girls had only brought a modest amount of items: toiletries, clothes, makeup, small comfort items, and so the space was sufficient for both of them to live in without becoming too crowded. Issei showed the girls where the towels were stored and told them that they could wash up and shower first while he cooked dinner. He busied himself in the kitchen setting up the pressure cooker as the sound of the shower running broke the silence. He was making spinach and bacon risotto. It was a simple yet hearty meal that would easily feed the trio without a crazy amount of preparation or work. Issei had everything in the pressure cooker within 10 minutes and then left the food to cook. He went to his room and quickly finished off the small articles of homework he had been assigned from his morning classes. The sound of running water had ceased, and so Issei picked up his towel and walked to the bathroom to have his turn showering. He opened the bathroom door and froze. Aquino stood in the room with only a black bath towel wrapped around her torso. The damp material clung to her body as she brushed her hair in the mirror. She turned to Issei at the sound of the door opening. Issei stood frozen and speechless for a moment before stammering an apology, and she giggled at his flustered response. He slammed the door closed and went back to his room. He threw his towel on his bed and returned to the kitchen to focus on tending to the dinner. It was in the pressure cooker and so needed no tending, but he tried to busy himself either way. The image of Aquino naked apart from the towel was burnt into his brain and causing havoc on conjuring up any other thoughts. Issei set the table and both girls joined him as he served up the food. Modest portions for both girls and a mountain on his plate. A large amount remained behind but was unlikely to survive the dinner. The girls each wore casual clothing. Rias wore a pair of white tight-fitting pants, a red halter top, and had tied her hair back in a ponytail with a pink fluffy scrunchie. Aquino wore a pair of black baggy pants and a yellow crop top that exposed her smooth navel. Her hair was tucked back in a braid. As the group began eating, Akino looked to Issei. "Did you enjoy the show?" she asked him brusquely. Issei almost choked on his food as Rias gave him a questioning look. "I'm sorry about that," he replied, still recovering from his food getting caught in his throat. "Oh, don't be sorry," Akino replied nonchalantly. "Next time I won't wear the towel if you like," her voice in her usual flirtatious and sultry tone. Issei blushed deeply at that comment and Rias smacked Akino lightly on the shoulder. She knew her friend was having fun tormenting Issei with her flirtatious nature, but was also aware that Akino would have done it if he asked. The rest of the dinner passed with Akino making lewd comments to embarrass Issei, Rias, or both at the same time. For the most part she was joking, but if the opportunity arose to act directly with either of them, then she would take it. With dinner finished, the girls took clean up as their way of giving thanks for the delicious food that Issei had made for them. As expected, there was no leftovers. It would be ludicrous to assume there ever would be again with Issei involved. Issei himself collected his towel and went to the bathroom to try again with the shower. This time he found the room unoccupied. He decided that locking the door was probably a good idea. He trusted the girls, but the way Akino looked at him said she might just accidentally walk in on him. He enjoyed the warm water on his muscles, no longer stinging the wounds to his back, which had practically faded away. It was good to be free of his school uniform. Despite the alterations made by Rias magic, the uniform was just not designed to be worn by someone with a tail, and it never would be. He swished his tail from side to side in the spray of water to relieve the tension of having it sitting awkwardly all day. A thought then occurred to him that with his parents out of the country he could have it freely out at all times whilst in his home. This was definitely a perk of the situation he was in. With his shower finished, he dressed in his baggy beige cargo pants and green singlet. He joined the girls in the living room and they had a light conversation while browsing for something to watch. Akino flicked the TV over to Netflix and asked if everyone would watch Designated Survivor. Neither Rias nor Issei had seen the series. Akino gave a brief overview of the show as the episode she was up to slowly began to buffer. The three settled in and watched the political drama. Issei quite enjoyed it, but what he enjoyed more was just sitting peacefully on the couch with the two stunning young women. They ended up watching 2 episodes before deciding to call it a night. Issei went to his bedroom and stripped of his singlet before climbing into the covers. Rias with Akino behind her made their way to Issei's parents' room, or as it now was, their room. The lights were all shut off in the house, and as Rias moved around to her side of the bed and began choosing what to wear to bed, she turned and caught a sight of Akino undressing. Despite being best friends for years, neither girl had undressed in front of the other before. Rias couldn't help but ogle Akino slightly. She did have a stunning figure. Akino threw her top at Rias as she unhooked her bra. "Are you being a perv, Miss Gremory?" she asked in a joking manner. Rias laughed off her friend's comment and resumed her search for nightclothes, glad to be looking away from Akino for the slight blush that graced her features at being caught looking. Both girls dressed in silken nightgowns. Rias in the turquoise one she had worn on her first night with Issei. Akino had a shorter light green piece on. Both articles of clothing could easily be described as sexy and accentuated the physique of their wearers perfectly. Akino flicked off the light and both girls climbed in the bed. They said goodnight and only the soft sound of breathing could be heard. Rias still felt slightly embarrassed for looking at Akino and for how pretty she thought her body was. She rolled over to the center of the bed and opened her eyes. Akino was lying on her back with her eyes open as well. She was looking up at the ceiling and Rias wondered what she was thinking about. Akino continued to stare at the ceiling and Rias found herself admiring the beauty of her friend. The softness of her skin, the clear piercing nature of her eyes. The silkiness of her hair. She closed her eyes and shook her head. What was she thinking? Surely this was just an effect of Akino's constant flirting. She couldn't have developed serious feeling for her best friend as well. She rolled back over to face the other way and lay there. She was starting to drift off when she felt the bed move slightly. She listened closely and while focusing, she could hear the feather-light footsteps of Akino moving and the telltale sound of a door being opened. Rias suspected she knew where Akino would be going. She had been into Issei's mind twice already and it only seemed fair that Akino get a turn, but Rias couldn't resist also going, and so she slipped out of the bed and followed after her friend. She sprouted her wings to allow her to float silently behind her. She watched Akino slip into Issei's room. Rias floated in the doorway and watched Akino climb into his bed and snuggle close to his sleeping form. Rias waited for her to drift off. Once she had, Rias knew that Akino would be unaware of Rias joining them as she would be in Issei's mind. Rias waited a few minutes and then floated into the room. Issei lay on his back in the middle of his single bed. Akino had climbed on closest to the edge of the bed. It would be a squeeze, but Rias knew that she could fit in the gap between his body and the wall. She did so and settled onto his other side under the blankets. His body produced so much heat that with the three of them in the bed it was quite warm, but Rias enjoyed the heat as she fell asleep. Grassy hillside, Issei's mindscape. Issei wore his training armor as usual. The moment he entered this world of his and Drake's, he had requested the armor immediately and then summoned the hillside of his childhood. Issei had focused on the memories he absorbed upon entering his mindscape and realized that he could in fact replay them. He first replayed the memory of the two boys with their master to ensure he hadn't missed any crucial aid to his training. Without being able to hear the words spoken, he decided he had gotten everything that would be of use. He then rewatched, so to speak, the memory of the saiyan boy fighting the green creatures. He watched the memory over a dozen times, all in the space of a few actual seconds. He was confident that with enough training, channeling and control of ki, and an understanding of the words the boy chanted, that he would be able to replicate his final technique, but there was just too many combinations of sounds that he could be saying as he chanted for through the attack. Issei watched the boy's lips intently but realized the boy could and probably would be speaking a different language to himself. He wasn't going to give up though. He only needed to get his mouth to move the same exact way and he could work out what was being said. That became much easier said than done though when he found that the first syllable the boy said could be either ma, sie, da or jie to name but a few. He decided it would be a long-term project and instead returned to start his training. He had Drake summon the poles that he had trained against previously, but this time 5 materialized and Drake had them fire small bursts of energy at him, much like a weak ki blast when they were at a distance from him. Issei fought against the poles which struck, twisted, parried and fired at him. He was finding Kaneko and the Saiyan boys' fighting styles becoming second nature to himself. He blocked an overhead strike from one pole and twisted to avoid being impaled by another when a feminine voice called out and distracted him. "Hey Issei," the voice cut through the air. He turned to see Akino approaching him in a rather revealing nightgown. She didn't even seem fazed by Drake. Although most likely because everything had been explained to her already. Issei dodged another attack and removed his helmet, signaling a short break as he approached her. "I didn't expect company tonight," he began, but she cut him off. "Well, you did say I was welcome," she responded in a rather sassy yet sultry voice. Issei couldn't argue with that. He had in fact made that agreement with the older girl. Drake made a small noise and Issei remembered his manners. He introduced the two to each other and Drake said how pleased he was to meet another friend of Issei. The way he said the words made Issei feel that the dragon may have been insinuating that both girls were more than just friends. Luckily, the conversation was interrupted as Rias approached the group. She said hello to everyone. Unlike Akino, she had changed her night clothes into the practical outfit she wore both times previously in his mind. Akino was slightly annoyed to see Rias here but figured that with Drake present and Issei so focused on training, nothing that she hoped for would have happened anyway. Issei asked both girls what they planned to do and Rias suggested that they have a more intense magical spar than they had back at the school on the previous Sunday. Akino accepted her suggestion with a deep smirk and the two girls moved apart. Akino used her magic to change her outfit into the same clothes she had worn that night during dinner. Both girls sprouted their wings and took to the air. Soon they dived and dodged whilst firing magical energy at the other. In their full devil forms, both were considerably more powerful but still held back so as to not injure the other. Whilst they had their duel, Issei continued his training with the metal poles. This continued for almost an hour until both girls were too tired to continue on and landed beside Drake to watch Issei's training. Does he ever tire? That armor looks so heavy and he is moving so fast. Akino asked of the dragon. It would take a lot more for him to tire so soon. Drake replied. The group made small talk, the girls happily gossiping with the dragon about world events he may have missed whilst Issei went on the offensive against the Poles. Perhaps due to Drake being distracted by the conversation or the speed with which Issei tapped into his key power for his offensive, either way, in a few short blows Issei had destroyed the Poles and stood panting but not too heavily so. Applause met his ears as the two girls cheered him on. Issei looked at them and saw the wings on their back. An idea forming in his mind. His smile grew broad as he ran over to the small group of winged folk. I want you two to spar with me now, he said abruptly upon reaching them. At your full power, he clarified. The girls looked to each other and Akino spoke to Issei in a voice that was not meant to patronize him but came close. Issei, sweetie, I know you're strong but you can't go against the two of us at full power. We have trained for years whereas you have around 2 weeks of experience. Her words were intended to talk him out of what she believed was a foolish plan, but instead they only encouraged his saiyan pride and ego into the challenge. Rias however spoke and Akino had not expected her words. Akino, I saw his proper strength last night when he learned to control his ki. He can match our full power attacks, she said with pride at how strong Issei had become. He nodded to her and jumped back a clear 40 feet before dropping into his defensive guard. Don't leave me waiting, he called out to the two girls. Rias looked to Akino with a serious expression. If Issei wanted to test himself against them, then she wasn't going to back down. Akino returned the look and the pair spread their wings and shot upward. Once in the sky, they charged their magical energy. Rias wanted to observe Issei and see how he would respond, and so watched as Akino dived at him and unleashed a bolt of lightning. Issei dodged the arc of electricity and jumped toward her. Akino hadn't expected him to be able to leap so high and was forced to swerve so as to avoid the flip kick that sailed past her body. She prepared another burst of lightning, but Issei had already fired a ki blast at her. Akino was pressured into using the bolt of lightning to destroy the ki. She rose back up next to Akino as Issei landed on the ground. Neither girl could see his face under the helmet, but they knew that he would be wearing a broad grin. Alright, you're right. He is pretty damn strong. I don't want to be on the receiving end of those blasts either, Akino admitted quietly to Rias. Rias simply hummed in response. She didn't want to take her eyes from Issei. She needed a plan. In terms of physical strength and stamina, he had more than both girls together, but their magical reserves were greater than his ki. Rias spoke her plan quickly to Akino. Issei was just watching them for now as they were out of physical range, and she knew that he didn't want to waste ki. We need to deplete his ki reserves. If he gets us in physical combat, then we lose immediately, she instructed her queen. Akino nodded, and the pair went into action. They spiraled down at Issei like a pair of military dive bombers. As they glided out into a hover, they each unleashed a pair of magical attacks each. Lightning crashed down toward him as balls of destruction magic honed in on him. Issei's smile grew even deeper. The girls were playing to win. This is what he had been chasing. He dodged right as a ball of destruction flew past him. A bolt of lightning too close to dodge, and so he fired ki at it to negate the blast as he dodged its twin bolt. An orb of destruction was missed by his next shot of ki, and his instincts told him to drop to the ground. He did, and rolled as the ball passed from behind. Issei smirked as he, though quickly, Rias could manipulate their flight path after firing. That made things even more fun. The trio continued like this. Issei dodging as the girls bombarded him from a height too great for him to reach. Issei knew what their plan was, but it was something he was counting on. He wanted to be under pressure with his ki levels depleted. A muscle under the right tension grows all the stronger, and for science the right tension is an absolute lot. Issei's ki was being worn down and his muscles burnt from the continued exertion of tonight's training. He dodged a destruction ball but was struck by a bolt of lightning that drove him into the ground. The two girls dived down toward the ground anticipating victory. Issei, however, let out a primordial scream and tapped into his full ki. His aura flared around his body at its full impressive height. Rias and Aquino were diving down toward him too quickly to stop, and before the girls realized what was happening, Issei had leapt the full distance to them and landed a strong elbow strike to Aquino, driving her into Rias. The force of the hit knocked the girls toward the ground and they crashed in a heap on top of each other. Aquino groaned at the hit Issei had delivered to her. She felt as if she had been hit by a freight train made of solid granite. Issei landed on his feet and rushed at the girls. He knew they couldn't get back to the air fast enough. Both girls panicked at his rapid approach and fired off their magic at full power toward him in a sustained barrage. Issei fired ki back in response, and both sides unleashed a constant stream of blasts. Aquino and Rias to push back Issei to break through their wall of fire. It didn't matter where he turned or moved though, the girls kept him suppressed under their magical barrage. Issei was close to winning and his saiyan instincts screamed for him to go for an all-or-nothing gambit. He needed height. Issei slowed his ki blasts and stood still. He fired only enough shots to stop the girl's magic striking him. He slowed his breathing and controlled his connection to his ki. Issei felt his remaining pool of energy. It was draining rapidly, and this would be his only shot at this. He grabbed a hold of the reserve and pushed it through his body and below himself. He wasn't sure if this was the correct method, but the results spoke for themselves. Issei shot up into the air like a white-tailed comet. He turned his trajectory and continued to expend his ki as he propelled himself down toward the girls like a missile. Aquino and Rias stood dumbstruck. Issei was flying. He had said he wanted to achieve it, but it was only last night that he had speculated on just how to do it. Drake chuckled merrily in the background. His host had once again proven how determined and driven he was in his pursuit of achieving self-improvement. Aquino recovered first and fired her lightning upward at Issei. Rias joined her, and balls of destruction magic resumed buffeting the space around Issei. Both girls were becoming exhausted. Their reserves were higher than Issei's, but they didn't know by how much or how little. Issei shot down toward his targets, but under such a heavy weight of attacks was forced to resume using ki blasts to break through their anti-air barrage. He was closing the distance. 100 meters, 80 meters, and his core was screaming out in exhaustion. 60 meters and his mind throbbed to collapse. 35 meters, but his vision was now blurring drastically. He screamed at his body to hold on, only 25 meters to go. His whole body shook and a heavy wrenching spasm ran through him. He could see the determined looks on the girls' faces. 20 meters and a ball of destruction caught him and his ki shattered. He used the remaining power to avoid blacking out completely as he spud into the ground. His aura vanished as Issei lay motionless. Drake rose his head in concern for his partner. He could feel the overwhelming exhaustion of Issei, but knew that the boy's vital signs were still stable, if a little outside of comfortable. Both girls joined Issei's side, their wings vanished as they dropped their power in concern for him. Rias knelt down next to him. She unbuckled the clasp of his helmet and tried to remove it. She grimaced at the weight of the red steel. Aquino joined her, and with a grunt both girls lifted the headpiece from Issei, promptly dropping it with a dull thunk onto the ground. After unclasping his chest piece, they pushed and rolled it off his body. The metal plating being far too heavy for the pair to lift. With his torso now free, the girls could see the soft rise and fall of his chest. Rias took Issei's right shoulder and shook him. First gently and then with more urgency. Issei grimaced and opened his eyes to look up at the two girls. The world swam and spun above him, but he was able to focus on their faces. "I flew," he said happily. It took a moment, but both girls realized that flying had been his whole goal all along. Rias was tempted to laugh and a snicker broke her lips. Aquino, however, raised a fist and smashed it down on Issei's chest, causing him to crunch together in pain. "You mean you hit me that hard just so you could fly?" she yelled at him in what Rias suspected wasn't genuine rage. "You're a jerk, Issei," she continued before her eyes softened. "If you wanted to fly that bad, I could have just taken you," she said softly in a genuine voice. All three laughed heartily at that. For their remaining time in his mind, they all just rested. The duel had drained the girls quite significantly, and Issei was more exhausted than he had even been. But he had flown. That was all that mattered. Issei mostly listened to the girls talking with Drake and only added his own input when he was spoken to directly. A single thought went through his mind over and over though. The next time he met Rainier, she wouldn't be able to escape his retribution.